It's just really, I don't know, I'm losing my voice today from all the conversations we've been having lately. So my name is Bev Pomeroy, and I use the pronouns they and them. And I'm super grateful to be the patient and community engagement specialist for the BC Support Unit Fraser Centre. I am an uninvited visitor on Turtle Island, having immigrated from Britain when I was a small child. Today, and you'll probably notice my internet connection isn't that great, I'm humbled to be moderating from Gabriola Island, quite literally sitting in the Salish Sea. And I'm humbled again to be on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular here on Gabriola, the Sunemu First Nation for us. So thank you, Lynn, for such an extraordinary start to our day. So before we get started, I would like to offer a reminder to that this presentation, next presentation, is being recorded. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you may send it to me via private message in the chat, and I'll bring it to our speaker's attention during the question period. And like Mag mentioned, you'll find a self-care guide in the chat that has some resources and tips. It was really important that we create such a guide, not just for this event, but particularly with the current environment that we're all having conversations about. And this guide includes suggestions for you to think about so you can be as comfortable and safe as possible. Whether that means taking stretch breaks, staying hydrated, turning off your camera, just really do something that keeps you centered and you grounded during our time this afternoon. The guide also includes a number of resources if you feel you need some additional support. And you can contact any one of us from the team if you do require support or have questions. Members of our support team are named on Zoom as Fraser Centre staff, like myself, and are also the people with our event logo as their Zoom backgrounds. So we ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation, and as time permits, we'll have a question and answer at the end of the presentation. And at that time, you may raise your hand to ask a question or place it in the chat box. So now it is a great pleasure for me to introduce today's keynote speaker. So Dr. Charlotte Loppie is probably one of my favorite people that I've met this last year, and is a professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy and Associate Dean Research for the Faculty of Human and Social Development at the University of Victoria. Dr. Loppie has spent the past 25 years working in service to Indigenous communities, collectives, and organizations, leading or co-leading health research networks and centers, original research, catalyst projects, and knowledge translation. She seeks to expand and support opportunities for Indigenous academic and community health researchers, as well as graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. Believing that every leader is a teacher and everyone is a learner, Charlotte centers the priorities of Indigenous peoples while respecting community leadership and capacities to self-determine. Dr. Loppie will be speaking today about decolonizing research. Welcome, Charlotte, to our...
Thanks so much, Bev. Can people hear me okay? Yeah, all right. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna share my screen with all of you. I think you'll see my dog first before you see my PowerPoint. There he is, little Chester. So yeah, I just want to thank Bev and others for inviting me to come and talk with you, share a little bit about what I've received in terms of teachings around decolonizing research. But before I do, I want to honor the territory that I'm a grateful visitor on, and that is the Lekwungen territory. Specifically, I have been received, welcomed, and shown great patience as I learned to be a good visitor on the lands of the Songhees and the Esquimalt and the Wasanic peoples. I'd also like to honor every Indigenous child, those who have been lost to us, but also balancing that with those who we've been blessed to have in our lives. And I don't want to let one more day go by without honoring those children. And I also want to honor my own family. I'm Mi'kmaq and French Acadian from Nova Scotia. This is 5 generations of my family, including my sweet daughter. I also married into the Black Nova Scotian community when I was 19, so 43 years ago. I think my math is right. And yeah, and so I'm also grateful for the teachings that I've received from my family in that community as well. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit before I get into the subject of decolonizing research about our roots. And so those of you who are familiar with my work know that I use a model of a tree in lots of situations to understand the environments in which we are experiencing our wellness, but also experiencing this thing we're calling research, right? And so colonial roots can be found throughout the research enterprise, right? And unless we look carefully down from our positions in what might be considered the crown of the tree, the stem environments of the tree, where we're all working and living and conducting research and partnering on that research, if we're not looking down into the core and into particularly the roots of that research enterprise, we're not really going to understand how to decolonize those STEM environments, because colonization continues to permeate the roots of Canadian society. That is political, social, economic, educational, justice. Every system, every structure in Canada and abroad have been saturated with colonial ideologies and governance, right? And so I want to start there. Won't spend too much time, but it's really important that we remember what we can do in the STEM environment is unlikely to have an impact on the core. So we have, and the roots. So we have to keep our eyes on those, right? So we know that Canada and other colonial countries are based on, rooted in the doctrine of discovery, which basically presumed that European people had right to land, and I would argue knowledge, if the inhabitants of that land were not sovereign to a European monarch, right, which included Indigenous peoples. So this concept of terra nullius, which is land belonging to no one, i.e. no one except European people, I would argue included this other concept of cognito nullius, which translates to knowledge belonging to no one, or people without knowledge, right? So again, really important to understand the presumption has always been that Indigenous people have no knowledge, or that European settlers have a right to whatever knowledge there is, to own it, right? And so just a very, again, quick quote from the Bagot Commission. This is the Royal Proclamation about Indigenous peoples and the responsibilities and the rights of colonizers, which was to ameliorate the condition of the Indians, right? Which was considered to be not civilized, right? And so 2 major colonial projects were underway. One was to settle people, which was to gather folks up and put them onto small pieces of land that were very poorly resourced, and then to provide Indigenous people with education and instruction and religion, right? So 2 projects, one to colonize and one to assimilate. These are roots, remember? So we have to think about those roots when we're talking about decolonizing research. Right, and so this is another quote I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Duncan, our friend Duncan Campbell Scott, not our friend, right, who wanted to get rid of the Indian problem, basically by assimilating every Indian child and person through residential schools, through enfranchisement and other policies, including the Indian Act, right? Again, this is an important route to remember. If we're not attending to this, we're not likely going to make much change, right? So let's get on to how is research been implicated in this? They say a picture shares or is worth 1,000 words. I think this picture says it all, right? This is about power and how to define what is worth knowing, what is knowable, and who should know. And so we've gone through a few stages in our evolution in terms of research, right? Originally, the government pretty much controlled Indigenous research, at least, and the research that was done constructed an image of Indigenous peoples that was pathologized, right? So it was a pathologic image of a people who were unhealthy, disorganized, and not able to take care of themselves. So the data created that image, right? Because we know data is not a piece of fruit. You don't pick it off a tree, you don't pluck it out of the ground, you create it, right? And then those data were used for this assimilation agenda, right? So the data were used to justify the problem as it was constructed, and the requests for funding of big organizations like the Department of Indian Affairs, the First Nations Health Branch, right? And so the problem that was created by the assimilationist and colonial project was then used to address these problems through policies that were not only ineffective, but we know, particularly from this week, that they were catastrophic. Residential schools, outlawing of ceremonies, and the indoctrination of Indigenous peoples into lots of different colonial systems, including religious systems. So then came the gatekeeper era, right? And so academics started to become involved in research about Indigenous peoples, but the government still held a lot of the control over data, right? And so accessing data from the government, getting permission to engage in data gathering about Indigenous peoples was still very tied to the federal control of what was considered the Indian problem. And those folks who were engaged in the data and now data gathering were, by and large, almost entirely non-Indigenous folks who were given access. Communities were not given access. Communities were not asked to give their consent to do this. So this is important, again, as a root, because the roots of a good relationship, if you think about it that way, one of the perennial roots of a good relationship is trust, right? If this is the case with respect to our historical research relationship, it's understandable why trust wouldn't be one of the perennial roots, right? And so then people say we went through a paradigm shift. I wouldn't call it a shift so much as I would call it a crawl. So we are still in the shifting paradigm. Paradigms are hard things to shift. They're not opinions, right? These are deeply rooted ideologies. These are worldviews. These are ways of understanding what knowledge is, how we go about gathering knowledge, who knows and who doesn't, whose knowledge is value. And so what we started to see was Indigenous peoples claiming and finding ways to be the stewards of our own data, right? And so some of you who are as old as me, maybe a little bit younger, will remember the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which was published in 1996, right? That was one of the landmark initiatives that started to change the game in terms of understanding the history, right, and how we ended up where we were in the 90s and still pretty much are, but also the expectations of Indigenous peoples about how things were going to be going forward, right? Part of that evolution was resulted from technologies, right? So that communities had better access to their data, but also there was a shift in the access to post-secondary education. So when I was going through mine in the 90s, very few Indigenous folks, I think the first book I ever read about Indigenous research methodologies was published by Linda Smith in 1999, right? And so, but we did start to see agencies opening up to sharing data. There was creation of new national institutes like the National Aboriginal Health Organization. There was the First Nations Regional Health Survey, which started in 1997. And out of that came the Ocap Principles, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. But those principles were game changers, right? But so was the First Nations Health Survey. It was the first time that First Nations people, and in the beginning, Inuit people, but they're doing something different now. But it was the first time that First Nations people were controlling research about their communities, and they were able to access that information and literally possess the information. And so what we saw in the early 90s was an emergence of research that was not just about Indigenous people, but was also by Indigenous people, and to a greater degree with Indigenous people. So in 2000, the creation of the CIHR, or the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, was a game changer as well, because one of those institutes, of which there are 13, is the Institute for, it was Aboriginal People's Health, now it's Indigenous People's Health. And people fought for that institute. So CIHR, those folks that were developing those institutes, weren't necessarily interested, and many people were against an institute that was dedicated to Indigenous people's health. And so thank you, Jeff Redding, who was the inaugural scientific director of IAPH, for the fight to get that, right? We also saw, again, as a result of the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health, there was a revision in the TCPS. The way that happened is in 2007, IAPH put out a call to Indigenous researchers and allies across the country to create ethical guidelines for CIHR. So they were CIHR guidelines, but IAPH led that. And I was very fortunate to be part of the group of people who went out into Indigenous communities and asked people, what do researchers need to do to keep you safe? And that information was instrumental in informing the TCPS. Although I will tell you, and most people who were involved in that will also tell you, that Chapter 9 is a very watered down version of those initial principles. If you're interested in seeing them, you can look them up. CIHR Ethical Guidelines 2007, and you'll find them. What we also started to see, and again, I went through this and was witness to it, which was pretty incredible, was the creation of Indigenous focused disciplines, academic programs, and more importantly, research methodologies, right? And so it was Indigenous people were starting to be considered sources of knowledge rather than sources of data, right? And so it was people were starting to focus more on learning from us than learning about us, right? And I'm not saying we're there, because we're totally not there. But this started to happen in the early 2000s, which I realize now is like 20 years ago. You know, you're getting old when 20 years ago seems like 5 years ago. Anyhow, this is just a bit of a trajectory just over that decade. And again, I see that that's again 20 years ago, right? But this is like 1998 when the three councils basically agreed to this statement, like the TCPS. People think, oh, it must have always been around. It wasn't. This is why researchers could do such horrible things in the past, without really being held accountable for it, because there was very little ethical overview, right? And then there was this work on the chapter 6, which is now chapter 9 of the TCPS, but that was early 2000s. The chapter 6 was written with the understanding that it was not complete. It was not really thoroughly informed. And so that's why it was really important that CIHR undertook a revision of the guidelines. The National Health Organization established the Ocap Principles in 2004. Again, these were principles. It would be nice if principles had teeth, but they don't, right? So people can promise things and then go back on those promises. And there wasn't before this much they could do. Now, thank goodness, there is. And then in 2010, again, as a result of the work that CIHR and IAPH did, chapter 2 or chapter 9 of the second edition of the TCPS. I want to look a little bit into this business of principles, right? So we talk about principles of research, principles of sharing. We use that term pretty often nowadays in terms of our decolonizing or Indigenous work, right? And so these are the definitions that I found, right? One is about a person, right? Is a person principled, right? Do they act according to some moral compass? Do they understand what would be considered right and wrong? But what I want to focus on today is the system, a principled system, or a principled method or protocol, we could call it, right? Based on a set of rules, right? That is things we agree upon that we will base our activities or our behavior or our relationships on. And so I'm just assuming most of you are very familiar with Ocap principles. If you are not, I will go over them quickly, right? Ocap is an acronym that stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. Ownership and possession are distinct in this situation, right? So I want you to think about your life story. Now, if you share your life story with someone, do they own your life story? Can they do what they want with it? No, right? And so in the same way, when Indigenous communities or their members share their knowledge, their experiences, the community still collectively owns it. They have a right to determine what gets done with it and what gets shared of it, right? So in that way, ownership is about the right to determine, what happens with our stories. Control is about the process, right? And so it's about ensuring that Indigenous communities, collectives, organizations control every aspect. And I would argue, and I will say later on, that includes the priorities that we're aspiring to, right? The priorities that we're following, the ideas that are coming up for research. And then access is pretty clear. That means people can actually access their data. Oops, sorry. I remember when I was going through my doctoral work in the early 2000s at Dalhousie, basically I was told by the ethics board, you can't allow community members to have access to their data. I was like, wow. So they're not allowed to have a piece of paper with their story written on it. And it took us 9 months 9 months to get through that process, because it was considered unethical for community members to possess or have access to their own data. And then the possession part is literally the mechanism by which ownership gets asserted, right? So, and that doesn't mean that people just like literally have it in their desk drawer. It means that Indigenous communities are stewards of their data, right? That means they can put in place mechanisms to protect it from other people who don't own it, even though it's been shared with them for the purposes of research. And so let's talk about the TCPS, core principles. Again, this notion of a set of guiding, I wouldn't call them rules, but rules of conduct, let's call it, right? And the first is obviously respect for human dignity. And, you know, this is a loaded sentence, right? Because research is sensitive to the inherent worth of all human beings. Well, if this week didn't teach us anything, it taught us that not all human beings are considered equally worthy, right? And so if we're looking at a principled approach, which I would argue is a decolonizing approach, it's not colonial, which means it does acknowledge the inherent worth of Indigenous peoples, nations, communities, right? Then it gets expressed in respect, right? And how we enact respect is really important. Are we concerned with the welfare of those people? Are we treating them like family, right? Equal in worth to the people we love best. And then finally, are we practicing justice, fairness, equity, right? And oftentimes, we don't know when we are acting in ways that are not following these principles. And so we keep being reminded in the same way that we know we're practicing in culturally safe ways when Indigenous people are telling us that we are. So when it comes to principled research or decolonized research, we know that we are expressing those core principles when Indigenous communities, collectives, and organizations tell us we are, right? Not when we tell ourselves. Right, and so now I'm just gonna get into the nitty gritty, checking my time, right? And so some of the principles, most of you, if you've ever heard anybody talk about this before, these will be familiar to you. But again, what I'm doing now is I'm sort of working my way up from the roots, which we have acknowledged already are entrenched in a colonial agenda, right? Into the core of the systems we work in, and then that STEM environment where we, you know, have our offices and we interact with communities and we go about our research work, right? And so keeping in mind the root, right? How do we then try to decolonize those STEM environments in which we work? Always with an eye to impacting the root, right? Well, first, easiest one is that we do not seek out Indigenous communities to answer questions that are of interest to us and useless to them, right? It seems like a no-brainer. And yet, it still happens a lot, right? Knock, 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 you know, on the door of the chief council, health director. I have a really good idea that I think will really help you. Yeah. Communities already know what the issues are and where the help needs to come from. And sometimes it doesn't come from research. If you don't have relationship with community, then you don't know the protocol. I really, I'm sorry, I don't remember the fellow's name or the person's name, but the person who opened us and followed the witnessing protocol. I was really, really grateful to see that. And I haven't seen that before in a research environment. And so I just wanted to raise my hands and thank you for that. But honoring those community protocols demonstrates the principle of respect, right? Making decisions about research agendas, funding, all of the operational work that goes into a research project, right? Distributing those, that power equitably or with the principle of justice or fairness in mind is really hard for people. And they often lean on the funding policies, the funding organizations as a way to get out of working through decolonizing that decision-making relationship, right? And so if we're really going to work on decolonizing research, then we're going to work against systems that put power in the hands of researchers and out of the hands of community. So that's our responsibility, to do the hard work, not to just say, well, the funder won't let us do that, right? We have to change the system. We have to attack the root, right? And then we have to understand as well. And when we're in relationship, we do understand that communities are diverse. No two are the same. One thing doesn't work in one place as it's going to work in another place, and they are complex. And as much as we might like to think that research is the, panacea for all of our problems, it's not. And communities are very busy dealing with things like murdered kids and COVID-19 and all kinds of other things. And so when researchers arrive at the virtual door of community with their great research, skills and ideas, they may not be welcomed in the way that they would imagine they were. And that's because communities have a lot of priorities, and research is perhaps one of them. But the principle also of humility will go a long way in helping us researchers to decolonize our process, right? So that we don't have a right to engage in research, just like the early settlers didn't have a right to colonize these lands. And so one of the things that, is a systemic problem that makes it difficult for us to practice decolonized research is that many of us who are professional academics, right, work in a post-secondary education, we're supposed to produce research, right? So research isn't a process in that environment, it's a product in that environment. And we're like the factory workers, like we're supposed to spit out research on a pretty regular basis, so the products of research. So it's supposed to get the grants, get the thing done, and then spit out the knowledge translation products and move along. Well, if we're really going to decolonize research, we are required to value the relationships that we develop and the processes we undertake over the products of those projects, right? And again, in decolonizing research, it's our responsibility to push back on a system that tells us you can't do that, or we don't value that, right? So it's not enough to go to the community and say, yeah, it's too bad because, my boss, dean, VPR, whoever it is, they just want us to just get this done really quickly, right? For people that are subscribing to that, I say, don't do Indigenous research, because that's not going to be beneficial to communities, right? And if we're practicing principled research, decolonizing research, respectful research, relational research, then we are required to value the relationships. And so if we can't do that, there's lots of other research that can be done. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to work in this field. But our job is to push back on the systems, our deans, our merit and review and tenure and promotion processes that say, this is what is valuable within the research enterprise, right? And the other area that, again, we're making some headway on is helping those systems to understand that the resources that we are allocated for the conduct of research doesn't always have to go to researchers. It doesn't always have to stay in the academic environment. Research assistants, associates, partners, those folks, there's tons of folks in community and in organizations that we partner with who are immeasurably valuable to the research process, right? And so we have to have sufficient resources to support those people, right? That means we try to keep as much money in the communities as we can, and that the training that we are able to produce also gets distributed in community. It doesn't mean that we don't support students or trainees within the academy. It means that we equitably allocate those resources across the different environments and across the different partners, right? Honoring the laws of ownership, again, all of these things, they really are, you can trace these back to the roots of a relationship with community, right? Every community, organization, collective that we work with is going to have its own, whether it's a law or a concept or an expectation of ownership and what that means, and control and access and possession. And it's only through humility and a principled relationship that we're actually going to know what those things are, and we're going to be able to follow those laws or those concepts, right? In the same way, we credit, anybody who's ever done a literature review will know that we credit academic knowledge in particular ways, right? We usually cite it in whatever referencing, standard we're using. But when we're doing decolonizing research, we have to credit Indigenous knowledge systems as well. We have to credit Indigenous knowledge holders as well. Again, do we work in systems that will, I hate to say allow, but that are welcoming to that kind of acknowledgement? If not, then again, it's our responsibilities as researchers, and maybe we can't do it alone. So maybe we join a group of people who are doing it, right? But to push back on that, and I'm again grateful to say that that's happening, not as quickly as we might like it, but that our knowledge holders and our knowledge systems are starting to be valued, not to the same degree as sort of Western, scientific knowledge, but definitely we're starting to see at least some kind of emergence of those knowledge systems being recognized as knowledge systems. And then there are some things that we cannot share, right? We know what we can't share because we have engaged meaningfully with Indigenous partners who will tell us what can't be shared, right? So we don't have to worry about making a mistake and sharing something if we are meaningfully engaged in relationship with our partners, because they will be involved at every step. They will be able to say, you can talk to this person, but you're not going to be able to share what they said. Or, yeah, I know what they shared was incredibly valuable, and wouldn't it be great if everyone could know that, but they can't, right? And so just because we receive learning doesn't mean we're allowed to share it. Sometimes it's just for us to learn, right? And not to blab it all over the place. The other trend, I don't know what a transformation that I've witnessed over the years, which has made me, hopeful, is that we are starting, not to the degree that we maybe still could, but we're starting to move away from at least a solely deficit-focused research agenda that pathologizes and stigmatizes and marginalizes Indigenous peoples, right? The problems of Indigenous health, right? So when we use strength focused research, which I've been very grateful to have been involved in at the request of community, because I don't do research that's not at the request of community. That research draws on strength. It talks about the wise practices that are working well in community, where community are using their own knowledge, their own cultural teachings, their own capacities to address problems, right? And so again, the assumption can't be that Western research is going to define the problem and Western systems are going to address the problems. Because again, if you believe anything I said earlier, it's Western colonial structures, systems, ideologies that have created the problem. So you're likely not going to fix the problem through those same systems, right? It's working with communities, with knowledge holders, to maybe, if you're invited, to lend your whatever capacities you have. I did want to just focus very briefly, and again, folks who know about the BC NEAR, the Network Environments for our Indigenous People's Health, will know that we use the term capacity bridging when we talk about capacity, what most folks call capacity building or capacity development. This is an aside, but it's just something that came to me now, and I thought I better say something about it, right? So we specifically use the term capacity bridging when we're talking about providing communities or collectives or organizations, Indigenous, with research, knowledge, skills, and techniques, right? So it's always been not even just my assumption, but for many, we know that communities hold a great deal of knowledge, a great deal of capacity to do many, many things right across the spectrum, right across sectors. So when we ask them, or when they invite us to be engaged in research, it's really just about bridging the capacities that they already have within the context of a research project, right? So budget management, well, lots of people in community manage budgets in lots of different ways, right? Project management, again, it's very unlikely you're going to find someone who hasn't done some kind of project management, right? So we imagine our skills to be a bit more unique than they actually are. It's just that we function within a particular context. So I think this notion of capacity bridging, A, it's reciprocal, but B, it's a bit more respectful than just imagining we're coming in and building people's capacity for this, right? And then we see that the strength focus, right? So it's focusing on, it might even be focusing on the same issues, but it's focusing on capacities and strengths rather than how people are unwell. I think we actually kind of know this already. Like, we've done a lot of research on this already. And so I wanted to, oh, I'm doing well on my time. I wanted to kind of end things off with another avenue toward decolonizing research. And that is to acknowledge the contributions that Indigenous peoples, cultures, nations, knowledge systems have made to what I say we, but what Western Academy has referred to as, research or philosophy, right? The philosophical underpinnings of research. One is this business of ontology, right? The nature of reality, right? And so a lot of people have come up with, like, discovered some of these, unique ways of understanding reality, when in fact, if you're familiar with Indigenous philosophies, ontologies, you will know that the use of an ecological framework, frameworks for understanding reality that are based in the natural world, the land, the water, the air, right? Those things have been grounding Indigenous philosophies for millennia. And so this notion of holism, right? People hear about this, but this has been around since the beginning of time. And the new age sort of concepts of intersectionality and syndemics, it's really just a different way of talking about holism, right? But people use that, they use that language, they use those concepts, and they never acknowledge that they're borrowing from, not that people mind, but at least acknowledging that Indigenous philosophies have held these as central to their ontologies since time immemorial, right? The same refers to this notion of temporality, right? This temporal connection. We hear a lot of people talking about life course and epigenetics, right? Well, we've been hearing about blood memory, intergenerational trauma, or, you know, this philosophy of living on a temporal plane in which the 7 generations before you and beyond you are part of your reality, again, has been part of Indigenous philosophies since the beginning of time. And then finally, this notion of learning as transformative, right? And so we talk about experiential learning as this new concept where, or fairly new in the last 50 or 60 years, where people are learning in ways beyond cognitive understanding, right? They're doing something, they're physically being transformed by the learning, right? And so again, if you think about the concept of holism and the notion of holistic learning and the notion of like the physicality, the spirituality, the emotion of learning, again, that's always been the teachings of Indigenous peoples around how someone becomes or how someone is transformed by learning. And that's why the written word, even oral traditions are not the only way that people learn, right? People are expected to be transformed physically, emotionally, spiritually by learning and cognitively. And then I wanted to talk just a little bit also about Indigenous contributions to epistemology, right? So what is knowledge, right? How do we know something? Again, the notion of interdisciplinarity has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years. I did an interdisciplinary PhD at Dalhousie in 1999. And at the time, I think they enrolled 1 student a year because it was such a weird, or considered to be kind of a weird program, because now it's like everybody's doing it, right? But at the time it was thought that, you know, it was watered down, right? That it was too diverse, it was not specific enough, and that I probably wouldn't get a job because of it, right? And yet now we've come to understand that when we turn 360 degrees around something and many people are looking at it, that we understand it in a more complex and subtle and dynamic way, right? And again, Indigenous knowledge systems have been teaching this for years, that we know in many ways, and that everyone learns something different, and then therefore has something meaningful to contribute to others learning from the same event or the same information, right? That the diversity of people's learning is what makes our collective knowledge more valuable, right? It's not that we narrow in on one theory, one person's perspective, right? That's been part of our learning for forever, right? And this, again, business of participatory learning, right? Again, this is a teaching that we have all received, most of us, at least all of our lives, is that everyone can learn from others, right? There is no one whose perspective has been solidified and that requires no more transformation, right? So that when we learn from others, they participate in our learning, right? And so I always say, and I know it sounds trite and people say it and maybe they don't mean it, but we learn often from our students. I learn from the ways in which my students actually take information in and then share it back, because it's a perspective that I often don't have. And yet I've learned something, like I've been transformed by their learning, right? And that we're all teachers, right? So again, this business of researchers having very distinct skills that are valued more highly than community members, and therefore they have no need to build capacity, right, is not the case, right? And so we're learning in the research environment that we all should be learning from one another. And yet within Indigenous worldviews, this notion that we're all teachers has been one since, since the beginning. So here's my final thoughts. And that is, as researchers, we want to be thinking always about what it is we're trying to achieve in our work. If we're aspiring to build a career, and I'm going to say it bluntly, on the backs of Indigenous communities, I beg you to choose another path, right? That's been done, and that's been very detrimental, right? What is our motivation? Is our motivation to be in service, literally, like my father was a mechanic? He worked in service to people who owned a car. He might have worked on the car, but he never owned their car, right? So are we working in service to community? Are we working for the relationships that we have with those communities? Are we acknowledging, respecting, honoring Indigenous knowledges? And are we using our power and our privilege, even those of us who are Indigenous, within this context to bring down systems that are privileging us and that are disadvantaging communities, right? I love this quote by Lilla Watson, and I think she was an Indigenous person from Australia. She says, if you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Thank you, everyone. I'm all done. Those are my references. And I think we have a little bit of time, 10 minutes maybe. Bev? Did I lose everybody? Wouldn't that be me? Whatever happened to Charlotte? We only saw her for 2 minutes.
Hi, Charlotte. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. That would be very funny. Would have been talking with intent. Does anyone have questions?
No.
No one has questions.
It looks like someone has raised their hand. Dr. Sean Haynes, if you wanted to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Charlotte. I was with Dr. Redding with the Aboriginal Working Group and with Shirk when we were trying to define Indigenous research. And you're right, about 20 years seems like 5. I was invited by Tri-Council to speak again about cultural property in Vancouver with Simon Fraser. I'm also a part of the Global Clinical Practice Network of the WHO during COVID. So I've been busy, but had some spare time. So I wrote down over 300 improvements in ethics and research. And so, when you're COVIDing, like this, and having coffee and working alongside health professionals in the United States with the Native Research Network and the Society for Indian Psychologists, I am an academic. I'm wondering, it may be about when Jeff and I were working with that group, it was about do no harm. How do we write something that can just be a basis to do no harm? And we can build later. And of course, that's how it got into chapter, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But as we build what can be ours in a loving and beautiful, full, wholeness is a beginning, but wholeness isn't love of land and waters and peoples and community. There's so much more.
Yeah.
And so I've begun to ask some of my colleagues who are in ethics, can we begin with love?
Mm.
I know when Jeff and I were working with the working group, where do you put love? So yeah, we didn't throw it out. It was awkward with do no harm and love, you know. So I've invited people to open it up again. And I'm wondering if the way to protect and begin with what our heart wants to do is to use the eagle feather. From the eagle that flies, we hold the feather for our voice. And I have a lot of different nations in me, but one of them's Mohawk. So whether it's one wampum or the other, I know there's a history of law, a foot deep or more, in the soil and the waters that comes from my history of great love, meowing. And so I was more perhaps Mohawk when I was involved in that work with Doris Cook and Jeff Redding. But I recently realized that the Peters and Stevens of me went to Nahanni and Naho, and so I didn't realize I was so related to people on Vancouver Island till I got there. And that happens over time.
Yeah.
I invite others to join me, but I think where I'm at from my experience in research and ethics is that we consider writing it with our ego feather in hand. We have it in the courthouse. We have it in many institutions, but I'll share right now in my work with COVID and 2 countries, what really stuck out as I'm dialoguing with all these systems, because I'm also an industrial organizational psychologist, do we have our ego feather in the workplace, which would go into governance in university? And love, but I also think an awful lot like a longhouse person. Like we don't sit in circles, we go out in the land, we look at the land. So recently we had 44 eagles fly around our schools.
Wow.
Then COVID happened. And the last speech I had to give was, I had to do it in Sioux because I was in an area like that. So I used the word mehituya, a deep and profound love. I'm also Glada Sioux. So I invite us to consider, would the eagle feather be a starting place for us all? And that if we open this up, as I know all of us on that working group did it with such love in so many communities, but it was about, can we do this so there's no more harm? That if we open it up, we include love and the eagle feather as a way of protecting. I can hold an eagle feather. I don't need to run and go get it. I have the caribou behind me because as I've spoken, I had the orange moon and an eagle going by as a way of honoring the residential school survivors. But as Len spoke, I knew enough to know what we need is those who can carry an eagle feather forward do so well with eloquence and clarity. And so I respect that, knowing that at some point that would come up. The caribou know how, with traction on their hoofs, to lead forward. So Charlotte, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. And with my love out to the coastline again, but Tri-Council invited me again to speak about cultural property, and Dr. Suzanne Zimmerman was there. They would put them through a bit of a drum law ethics test about the environment, and they handled it well. I think they even have an Indigenous person around COVID. They may be open, you know how timing can be different things to it. And if you need to use my name to forward that, she knows me. And she knows I work with the WHO as we place our eagle feather voice within the UN. So thank you so much. And I encourage you forward with your tremendous work.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. I think we just have a couple.
Well, I just want to say, hey, Charlotte, I just want to say, this is Bev speaking. Again, being on Gabriola, my internet is so great here. I just want to say thank you so much, Charlotte. I learned so much every time you come and talk, or every time I've when I've sat in your office, and your words are just so extraordinary to me. And I really like something you said about receive learning and not to share it. And I think sometimes we forget that, in our research world. We want to get information and we want to learn so much, and then we want to share it and publish it. And you're right, and that just sort of really resonated with me. And this idea around capacity bridging versus, again, capacity building, like we're doing somebody a favor, and that it's reciprocal and respectful. So thank you so much for being here today, and allowing us to be able to capacity bridge for the people that are here listening to your talk and your presentation. And just so grateful to have you here, and I look forward to our next hopefully in-person meeting. So thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you, Bev, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, I wish you all best wellness to you and your families. So take care.